Well, hello and welcome back to another ASR Live. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. If you're not familiar, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was really formed around looking at things like restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, a lot of the things that were being done in schools to children, often in the name of behavior that were having really negative outcomes. Kids that were being restrained and secluded were subjected to trauma, were injured, and kids have even died in the name of restraint and seclusion. We really started the organization to raise awareness about these issues, but we also are working to change, hearts and minds and laws and policies so that things like restraint and seclusion are reduced and eliminated in schools across the country and beyond. And part of that conversation is thinking about what are the better things we can and should be doing to better support children and all individuals really in our schools and other settings as well. In that vein, I'm really excited about our guest today. Excited to have Sara Jo Soldovieri. And I thought to myself, I should have asked Sara Jo how to pronounce her name to make sure I was doing it right. She'll be here to tell me in a second if I did it wrong. Hopefully I did okay. But Sara Jo is going to be joining us for a really special presentation talking about inclusion. And when we think about how do we create better environments for all kids, especially kids that have not been getting the support and help they need, inclusion is always a great topic of how can we be more inclusive? How can we do better? You will have an opportunity to ask questions today, and we're going to ask you to hold your questions till after the presentation. And feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and we'll go back and we'll look for those questions that might come up. So if you're afraid you're going to lose your question, don't hesitate to put it in the chat, and we'll come back and find it. The session is being recorded as always, so you'll be able to watch it later on YouTube. And we encourage you to share it. These are great conversations to share with other parents, other educators, other administrators, whoever you might be, and whatever kind of work that you're doing. They're also available as an audio podcast, so we make those available for people to listen to. So with all that said, let me get to the great part here. And the great part is always introducing our guest and talking about what we are going to be talking about today. So I am very excited to introduce Sara Jo. And Sara Jo, did I do okay on your last name? I'm sorry.
Yes, you did great.
Okay, perfect. I'm always worried, and that was the one question I didn't confirm with you, even though we've known each other for quite some time. You just get used to calling people by their first name. So Sara Jo is a PhD student studying inclusive special education at Syracuse University, and you are trained, let's say 1 to 12 inclusive special educator. So you're trained as a 1 through 12 inclusive special educator. Your work has centered around students with complex support needs in inclusive settings, inclusive higher education, education policy, decentering whiteness within education, breaking down hierarchies with disability, and pre-service inclusive educator training. So you have been spending your time as you've been working on your PhD, really not only learning but immersed in all of this, everything from how to make changes in the classroom to what are the policy changes that need to be made to better support things. So we are really excited to have you. And the one thing I didn't mention in your bio, and this is probably one of the most important things, you are a volunteer with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint as well.
Yes.
So that's a great way to introduce you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We're really excited about this topic as well. And I just want to let people that are watching know, if you would, it's always fun to see who's watching and where you're from. We know we get a lot of people from all over the world that are watching these events. We have people typically from Australia and Canada and New Zealand and the UK and all over the world. We've had people from, I'm trying to think, India and South America. It's always fun to see who's on. So tell us who you are, where you're from, whether it's a different state here in the US or a different country. We'd love to know where you're from. And Sara Jo, what we're going to do is bring up your screen. And I know you've got a presentation for us. And we will, of course, be taking questions after your presentation. But this is really exciting. So let me go ahead and bring up your presentation. And we're going to bring that up right now. And your presentation is on screen. We're getting a couple of hellos here. Let's see, we've got somebody from Edmonton, Canada joining us. We've got somebody from North Carolina as well, Donna. Hello, Donna. It's always good to see familiar names. And yes, it is being recorded. Somebody from Illinois as well. So we've got a number of people joining us, and really excited to have you talked about this topic? Because I know from talking to you how passionate you are about this. And I also know, one of the things that I think is really interesting is, there are parents out there that, when they think about inclusive education, they think, well, that's a great idea, but probably wouldn't work for my child. And I know that you're somebody that has advocated and worked with children really with very diverse needs, and
Mhm.
thinking about what that looks like and how it might work. So I think it's really going to be helpful. Just to point out a couple, we have somebody joining us for the first time. Tanya, great to have you here.
Mhm.
I have somebody from Connecticut, and very excited about the presentation. Tanya, of course, is from Anaheim, California. Olivia, who is a former presenter and also somebody we're really excited to work with here with us, and somebody from Syracuse, New York. That sounds like somebody that you might
Right.
even know in that
I
neighborhood,
was
right?
saying right by me. Yeah.
That's right. That's great. That's great. So let me go ahead and give you the reins. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to disappear while you present. I won't be far. I'll be just kind of off stage here, so to speak. So take it away. And thank you so much for doing this for us today.
Great. Thank you. And thank you so much again for having me. I would also add, I'm a really proud product of an inclusive education. My best friend growing up has Down syndrome and was fully included with us, which initially sparked my passion for inclusive ed. So I see some familiar faces. So some of you, this may not be new information. For some of you, it may be. So let's start with what is inclusive education. I want to start with this idea that we will know inclusive education has really become embedded in our culture when the term becomes obsolete, meaning our goal is that we move towards not even needing the term inclusive education, that it is just embedded through what we do. And I'm going to get in a little bit later about why we have these different terms for it as a note on language, and how it connects to our laws as well. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is what is inclusive education. So inclusive education is a philosophical framework that views all learners as capable thinkers, authentic members, and value contributors who can be educated within general education settings in their neighborhood school with differentiated and teaching and learning strategies that match their strengths, learning styles, challenges, interests, and needs. And there are a lot of definitions for inclusive education. Why I utilize this one is because it specifically says in general education classrooms. And for me, that is the big piece of inclusive education. We see sometimes this term of inclusion being co-opted to mean, oh, well, it's, inclusion if we just have lunch and recess. And no, it is in general education classrooms at all points of the day. So I have this flow chart on the right, and some of you may have seen this before, but it's pretty much my favorite thing to show when I do trainings for schools. Is the first thing I start with. So who can be included? Go down. The first question is, do you have a disability? And if the answer is no, then yes, of course you can be included. If the answer is yes, you do have a disability, we get to the all-important question of, are you breathing? If the answer is no, then there's not a good chance that you can be included. The answer is yes, you are breathing, then yes, you can be included, meaning the only barrier, the only hoop to jump through, the only metric is, are you breathing? Are you a person who is alive? If yes, then you can be included. Inclusive education also means that students with the most significant cognitive disabilities to have access to the same instructional and non-instructional experiences alongside peers within general education classrooms, with appropriate instructional adjustments to meet their needs. I bring this up because we sometimes hear, oh, inclusion for certain types of kids, or for this, or for that. And when we say inclusion, we do in fact mean inclusion for all students, even those who have been labeled as having the most complex support needs. Central to inclusive education is this idea of presuming competence. And to presume competence means you should assume that a person with a disability has the capacity to think, to learn, to understand, even if you can't see any tangible evidence to prove this. You might think, oh, this, of course we do that. But it's actually a controversial topic in the field of education. There are scholars who argue that no, it is only when we have discernible proof that a student can learn that we hold them to those standards of learning. But we would say, no, the least dangerous assumption is to presume competence. Meaning, is it more dangerous to assume a student can learn? So we give them every opportunity to do so, and it turns out that they couldn't. Or is it more dangerous to assume that this student could not learn, so we don't give them any opportunity, and it turns out that they could? We would say that it is less dangerous to assume that the student can learn, even when we have no tangible proof. Give them those opportunities to do so. And I will say from my experience and many other people experience, I'm coming to you with, standing on the shoulders of 40 plus years of work by scholars in inclusive education, that if we give students the opportunity, they can in fact learn. Inclusive education must also be intersectional. So intersection of disability, race, class, gender, language, which has been conceptualized by Black feminist scholars, is critical to understanding and must be intentionally centered in this work. We know, right, when we look at the numbers of students who are more likely to be put into segregated spaces, who are more likely to be restrained and secluded, it is students of color, students who are disabled, and students of color. We cannot look at this as a single issue problem. It is a multidimensional problem, and we must look at it through an intersectional lens to honor the differing identities of all of our students and teachers and related service providers and administrators and parents. I also want to talk about why I use the term inclusion versus mainstreaming, and you'll hear those interchangeably in the dialogue around inclusive education. And a lot of folks would argue that we need to move on beyond inclusive education, but for the purpose of today, I do not like the term mainstreaming, because mainstreaming has this connotation that we're putting students into general education spaces at times that we have deemed appropriate, whereas inclusion looks at providing the supports and services needed to the student in that space from the very start. So I often hear schools when I advocate at IEP meetings say, oh, well, we do mainstreaming. Oh, lunch, recess, art at those times that we have deemed appropriate. Whereas inclusion is purposely planning from the start to support those students in those spaces. So what is the problem? Within a US context, we have two systems of education. We have our general education, and then we have special education, and they are siloed from one another. I would argue that it is only if we intermesh those and do not have separate systems of education that are siloed that we can ever truly achieve equitable education. Because what has happened, and as many of you have seen through your own experiences, whether with your students, your children, through your professional life, is that these two things these two systems of education do not talk. If you are a student who receives special education services, that automatically means you must go over there to that special space. Whereas general education is the default then, right, for folks who are not disabled. And this is a problem because the special education system is what allows for legal segregation of students with disabilities in our country. Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen has some really great work on this if you're interested further. So you might be thinking, well, okay, why are we talking about inclusive education? It sounds like a really, fluffy, nice idea, but what does matter in terms of learning? So 40 years of peer-reviewed research would tell us that inclusive education is the best way, the most equitable way, the way that students are going to learn the most. So let's dive into what a very small sliver of what the research says. So why do we push inclusive education beyond the social aspect? Well, students with disabilities in inclusive settings have shown improvement in standardized tests, acquisition of social and communication skills that were previously underdeveloped. They've shown increased interactions with peers, achieved more and higher quality IEP goals, and are better prepared for post-school experiences. The positive effects of inclusive education on classmates without disabilities has also been well documented. Both research and anecdotal data have shown that typical learners have demonstrated a greater acceptance and valuing of individual differences, enhanced self-esteem, a genuine capacity for friendship, and the acquisition of new skills in inclusive settings. So it's more of the research say, and I leave this up because I know we have some parents watching who may want to take tidbits for their IEP meetings that are coming up. I know we're in kind of annual review season for next year. So students with complex support needs make academic, social, and behavioral gains when they are educated in general education classes. Students with complex support needs who are educated in inclusive general education classes generally receive more instructional time and more individualized attention than those who spend their days in segregated classrooms. Now that's an important piece, because sometimes we often hear, oh, if your student goes over here to our special class, special day program, special autism support classroom, that's where they're going to be able to receive the services that they need, the individualized attention, it's the environment that they need. And what research actually says is they're actually getting less instructional time than if they were in a general education classroom, and it's less likely to be individualized to their needs. Benefits of students with the most significant cognitive disabilities being in general education classes extend beyond learning, but include better social and long-term outcomes, such as better employability in competitive wage jobs and independent living. I'm seeing a lot of folks who are on the stream are from, a community I hold very, very near and dear to my heart in the Down syndrome world, and that, we know that it is an extremely small number of folks with intellectual disabilities who are competitively employed. Well, why is that? Not only because of the infrastructure in the system by which we exist that has not prioritized allowing disabled individuals to save money, but also because we have students who are sitting in segregated spaces who are not gaining the skills that they need to have access to these competitive wage jobs. What the research tells us is that when students are in inclusive settings, even students who are labeled as having the most significant intellectual or cognitive disabilities, they are more likely to have competitive wage jobs and independent living than they would be in segregated specialized programming. Students with complex support needs make more progress in inclusive contexts than in segregated contexts. We see, going back to the 90s, significant increases in spelling, social studies, and other academic indicators were observed. Now, looking at the national longitudinal study examining 11,000 students with a range of disability types, found that more time spent in general education classrooms was positively correlated with fewer absences from school, fewer referrals for disruptive behavior, and a better outcome after high school in the areas of employment and independent living. Again, stressing that we have the data, we have the research to say when students are in general education classes, they have better skill acquisition, social acquisition, language acquisition, and long-term, these are the students who are most likely to have better outcomes after high school. Now, when you might hear the phrase "all means all." It's something I believe enough that I actually have it tattooed on my body that when we talk about inclusive education, we are talking that it benefits all students. Something I hear from IEP teams is, well, what about the impact on the typically developing students? Well, let's talk about it. What does the research tell us? Engagement time for typical learners is not negatively impacted by the presence of students with quote unquote severe disabilities. Presence of students with disabilities results in a greater number of typical students making reading and academic progress compared to non-inclusive general education classes in the area of academic progress. What does that mean? It means inclusive education, when we have students with disabilities in general education spaces, education gets better for all students. We have better acquisition of those core academic concepts for students who are labeled as having a disability, students who are not labeled as having a disability, because it forces us to have dynamic, adaptive instruction that then better meets the needs of all students. Now, what about behavior? I'm going to start with this idea that compliance is not our goal in inclusive education. I love this tweet from Tim Vegas. It says, how many chances should you give a student who has challenging behavior? And the answer is all of the chances. Dr. Ross Green says the long-term answer to a kid not caring about your concern is to care more about his. Now, behavior is a complex topic, and I know there's been many lives and great resources here that you can refer back to. But I want to say, related to inclusive education, that when we're looking at inclusive education as a systems change issue, we're also looking at the capacity to support students who may have some more behavioral needs. But that must be done in a vein that we're not trying to simply control students' behavior. We're trying to help students gain the skills to communicate, the skills to self-regulate, to do the things that they need to do. And we know that the research shows, the data shows that students are more likely to be restrained and secluded if they're labeled as having a disability, and particularly if they are in those segregated spaces. So coming back together, right, it's not a single issue thing. We have to be building the capacity, and through training, through dismantling of these segregated programs, to support all students, including those with behavior challenges. So traditional or segregated special education actually builds that gap that we often hear school districts say, well, if we close it, right, then they can go in here. So let's talk about it. Segregated or traditional special education utilizes the prerequisite model of learning that posits that students with complex support needs must progress through early developmental milestones before they are able to learn grain-aligned academic content. I'm sure many of you who are parents or practitioners have heard of, oh, this is a foundational skill, they must have this. And I always question that, especially when I'm in IEP meetings. We'll have students who are working on one-to-one math correspondence to 12th grade and have never been introduced to adding or subtracting because they have not been able to master this skill. And what we do with inclusive education is we look at what is the standards that apply to all students, and how can I, having identified what the student needs to work on that skill through what we are doing in general education, which provides more opportunity, more complex opportunities for our students to dynamically engage with content, thereby having a better chance of mastering said content. Which is why when we hear, oh, well, we can't do this, we can't go into general education before we learn this, our answer is no, we have to be able to learn. If we deem that this skill is so essential and so fundamental, there are ways to embed that through the core curriculum. So it's not a stepping stone acquisition. It is more of a dynamic, natural acquisition. I also question the actual need of some of these quote unquote fundamental skills. I have another presentation that I do that talks about life skills. And without getting too much into that, I want you to think about things like time and money management that are often seen as these foundational skills in segregated special education programs. And think about the last time you've gone to the store. You went to go pay for something. What did you grab? You probably grabbed your credit card, your debit card, your phone, your Apple Watch, but you did not grab a bag full of pennies, nickels, and dimes. It's simply a skill that is not used anymore. So what we do when we move away from this prerequisite model of learning is give ourselves permission to say it's okay to introduce a concept and move on from it, or position it within learning more advanced concepts. And I know that's a large thing we could spend a whole other live on. Traditional special education also posits things like work readiness. This was something I saw. This I actually saw a few years ago on Instagram, and I copied out the names, but it says somebody commented. So you see on the screen are a bunch of, they look like face cleanser or wipe things you would get. And someone said, this would be perfect for a life skills class to practice stocking with. And so instead of learning reading, writing, or math, we have students as young as 3 years old in the United States who are practicing quote unquote job readiness skills, with the irony being that those job readiness skills aren't actually positioning them to become job ready. Traditional special education is grounded in the assumption of identifiable and meaningful difference. It is a field with deep roots in behaviorism, positivism, psychology, and medicine. The purpose of education has become remediation of identified deficits with the goal of moving the person towards a more normative way of being. So traditional special education looks at disability as something to be fixed. Whereas inclusive education, we give every student the supports that they need to be successful. You'll see a little on the bottom, a little meme I made and has been shared that life skill classes are the new institutions. Change my mind. These idea of life skill classes or adaptive classes are rooted in institutionalization as a product of when we stopped institutionalizing folks to the scale that we did, also, but with a reminder that there are still 1 million people in the United States who are in institutions currently. That the system we have in education is born out of perhaps some of the most egregious treatment of disabled people we have in the United States, directly from institutions. Inclusive or traditional special education is also deeply rooted in ableism. From an ableist perspective, the devaluing of disability results in social attitudes that uncritically assert that it is better for a child to walk than to roll, to speak than to sign, read print than read braille, spell independently than use a spell check, and hang out with non-disabled kids as opposed to other disabled kids. In fact, in the eyes of many educators in society, it is preferable for disabled students to do things in the same manner as non-disabled kids. And so what I want to be really clear on is that inclusive education is not fixing disabled students. It is not moving disabled students to a normative center of being. It is honoring what that disabled student has and giving them the supports to be in general education, to make whatever progress they're going to make in whatever way they are going to. But it is not, as we see in places who utilize things like VB-MAP, ABA. It is not to move students to be indistinguishable from their non-disabled peers. That is not our goal with inclusive education. So I have a little chart. On the left, you'll see traditional segregated special education with the goal, whether it is implicit or not, whether it is outwardly said or something that is just embedded, is to assimilate disabled students through forced compliance to a non-disabled way of being, with rooted in racist and ableist practices with direct links to institutionalization. Whereas inclusive education, we're meeting students where they're at, bringing the supports to them while making systems changes. It's grounded in culturally sustaining pedagogy, which according to Paris and Alim, demand explicitly pluralistic outcomes that are not centered on white, middle-class, monolingual, and monocultural ways, norms of educational achievement. Also rooted in disability justice. And I have a quote here from Chris Cleaver that says, "To value another is to recognize diversity as the norm. It's essential that equal rights of all school children, a sense that we all benefit from one another, and the fundamental right of every student to belong." And that is what we want to get to with inclusive education. It is not simply about disabled students being present. It is about creating a system that recognizes diversity as the norm, as opposed to forcibly assimilating students to that norm. Now, without completely sidetracking us, I want to share from Sins of an Invalid the 10 principles of disability justice that are central to inclusive education: intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalist politics, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. Again, inclusive education will not ever be achieved if we only look at it as a disability issue. Specifically from a white disability lens, we must be intersectional in this, or we will be continuing to leave folks out. So from a worldview, The Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the CRPD, states persons with disabilities are not excluded from the general education system on the basis of disability, and that children with disabilities are not excluded from free and compulsory primary education or from secondary education on the basis of disability. It also says effective individualized supports measures are provided in environments that maximize academic and social development consistent with the goal of full inclusion. Now, I'm sure it is not shocking that the United States has not signed on nor ratified the CRPD. Those of you who are in the US, I'm sure can say this is not something that in the US we could say that we do. We consistently exclude students from general education on the basis of disability. In fact, our primary law explicitly allows that. So speaking of that primary law, let's get into the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDEA, which is the federal law that guarantees the rights of disabled students to have access to public education in the United States. So the purpose of special education, where did it go? So according to IDEA, the purpose of special education is to ensure access of all children to the general curriculum so that the children meet educational standards within the jurisdiction of the public agency that apply to all children. Now, I want you to think back to what we were talking about life skills. Now, we could all say that yes, every student needs life skills. Every student needs to be able to go to the grocery store, to buy things, to budget, etc. And we would have no problem with every student doing that. The problem being, if we only take disabled students and force them to do it in a way that we don't for students who are not labeled as having a disability. Further, we would argue that those things do not meet the standard that IDEA sets in access to the general curriculum to meet the standards that apply to all students. Unless we are having all students do this, we should not be having disabled students do it. So Individuals with Disability Education Act gives us, there's 6 main rights that we talk about through IDEA. First one is a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. Least restrictive environment. These are the 2 I'm going to dive a little further into. Appropriate evaluation, parental participation, individualized education plan, or IEP, and due process. So FAPE, or Free Appropriate Public Education, is an individualized education program that is designed to meet the child's unique needs and from which the child receives educational benefit as it is outlined in their IEP and prepares them for further education, employment, and independent living. Now, FAPE applies to students ages 3 to 21. Some states have elected to go above 21, but at a minimum must apply to 21. Now, where we get murky in this, because with all of these laws, the problem is the murkiness, this gray area that we allow to exist. So for a long time, we had a standard for what does it mean to be appropriate. My idea of appropriate versus yours versus another person's is going to be different, which is where we get into a lot of these battles. Now, the Endrew decision, which was the most recent Supreme Court case to weigh in on this, is to FAPE needs to be more than de minimis. So to meet its substantive obligation under IDEA, a school district must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Now, this is a significant improvement from the previous standard, where students simply had to be receiving some educational benefit under the Rowley precedent. But I want specifically those of us who work with folks who may have more complex support needs or are labeled as having complex support needs, because I do think we should problematize what is complex about a lot of these supports. It's that when we think about, in light of the child's circumstances, if we have folks who are not presuming competence, are not presuming that students can learn academic content in general education, this could be used, right, and has been used to further segregate students. We may have folks who are arguing that, oh, well, in light of their circumstances, by having, an X IQ, that means the best we could possibly do is teach them how to wipe tables. But we would go back to our educational research that says actually these students learn more when we're in these academic general education spaces. So faith is still, there's still no one standard. It is in light of the individual child, it's that individualized. But coming back to what we know about what is fundamental to inclusive education is that presumption of competence. So least restrictive environment, perhaps the thing I talk about the most in my work. So what does LRE say? A school district must educate any student with a disability in the regular classroom with use of appropriate aids and supports, referred to as supplementary aids and services, along with the student's peers without disabilities in the school he or she would attend if the student did not have a disability, to the maximum extent possible. Now, there's a few things I want to hone in on. In the regular classroom with the use of supplementary aids and supports, and this piece of along the student's peers without disabilities. Because what you'll often hear is, oh, well, that is the child's least restrictive environment, is over there in the life skills class with only disabled students. But what does IDA say is LRE is actually with your non-disabled peers. Let's keep reading into what LRE says. LRE continues to say, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are not disabled in special classes, separate schooling, or other removal from the regular educational environment occurs only when the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. I bolded here, with the use of supplementary aids and services. And it's not simply enough for a school district to look at paperwork of testing and say, oh, I think this student is so impacted they cannot make progress. We actually have to try it with the supplementary aids and services, meaning just because you have a student in general education, if they're not making progress, our duty is then to look at what are those additional supplementary aids and services that we can be bringing. Because we know once we have those supports in place, the students can make progress. But what the law says is if the student can make progress with those supplementary aids and services, then that is where the student needs to be, is general education. IDA uses the term regular education environment, but I'll use them interchangeably. Now, this means that for many students, they're going to need modified curriculum. And I've heard in my past work and my current work, oh, well, we cannot modify this any further, whether that is a 12th grade math class or whether that is a 2nd grade English or math class. I hear this. And what do the regulations say is that a child with a disability is not removed from education in age-appropriate regular classrooms solely because of the needed modification in the general education curriculum. Meaning, if it can be modified to meet the student's needs, then it has to be. That alone is not a reason to remove the student. Further, it is not a reason to hear, oh, well, I think it's too watered down. Because then we're holding the disabled student actually to a higher standard than what we expect students who are not disabled. Because students who are not disabled also may not get 100% of the curriculum, and that is not forcing them into segregated spaces. So the regulations specifically say this. And this is something for parents who are watching, something that I would screenshot and hold to bring to your IEP meeting, that just because we need extensive modifications, that is not enough to say the student cannot be in general education. So where does LRE apply? This is something I didn't actually used to include until pretty recently, until an experience advocating for students to be on a standard bus. But it applies to the classroom, so general education, students should be in general education, to after-school clubs if they are school-sponsored, and to buses. Buses, transportation, whatever that mode is for your school district. So that is what the law says, and I'm sure many of us who are in here know that just because the law says it doesn't always mean that it happens. So let's look at a few cases that are beneficial to advocating for inclusive education. So Alberti versus the Board of Ed from 1993 is possibly one of my favorite decisions. And it stipulates that a child should not have to earn his way into an integrated school setting by first functioning successfully in a segregated setting. Inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few. Success in special schools and special classes does not lead to successful functioning in an integrated society, which is clearly one of the goals of IDEA. This is directly from the court decision. And what is so great about this decision is it looks at all the supplementary aids and services that were not used to support the student in the classroom as the basis for why the student should be included. So again, we cannot remove if we can make progress with those supplementary aids and services, and we have to exhaust those before we can look at removing. This also, let me go back for a second. This also talks about not having to earn your way in, right? So how many of you have heard, oh, well, when they close that gap or when they, exhibit X, Y, and Z, then they can go into there. Well, the Alberti case tells us we do not have to earn our way in. The portability principle, perhaps, okay, my second favorite, Ronacher v. Walter, which is the court decision says it is not enough for a district to simply claim that a segregated program is superior. In a case where the segregated facility is considered superior, the court should determine whether the services which make the placement superior can feasibly be provided in a non-segregated setting, i.e. regular education or general education. If they can, then placement in the segregated school or classroom would be inappropriate under the Act IDEA. So if there's something so special that is happening in that segregated space, our first piece is to look at what is it about that space that is deemed necessary for that student to make progress. And then we look at how do we bring that in. I often hear things like, oh, well, smaller teacher ratio, or we're going to be able to get individualized instruction, or just this fallacy that there's something special that happens in these four walls in a segregated program that can't be emulated. And the research would tell us that that is actually not true, that actually we're going to get more individualized instruction over here. But more importantly, Ronacher v. Walter with the portability principle gives us the base to say, well, actually, if you have that program over there, then you need to bring it into general education. If you have that support over there, then you need to bring it into general education. And unless it cannot be brought in, unless it is so, chained to that specific location, which I quite frankly can't think of anything that is, needs to be brought into the general education setting. Another good piece for those of you going into your annual IEP meetings to have. So I think, I'm just about perfect on time, I think. I'm going to end again with a quote from the Alberti case, that inclusion is a right, not a privilege for a select few. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and get to questions.
Thank you so much, Sergio. This has been fantastic. And I think we've got a number of comments and questions here. I'm going to start the ball rolling, though, if you don't mind, and ask a couple myself, and then we'll get a couple from the audience. One of the things I thought was really interesting, and I would love to hear more from you on, is, I think how to put this the best way I can. Many times, not only my own experiences, but the experiences of many of the parents and families that we've worked with, we find the idea of inclusion being thrown about as, oh, well, they're an inclusive PE and lunch and art, and it's always the same things. And in fact, what always strikes me about it, because I would say that if anything, it's probably lazy inclusion, right? It's like what can we do to say we're being inclusive? What can we do to say that we're offering experiences with their peers? And I would say that many of the kids that I have known and the experiences that I've had, those environments are actually among the most difficult for a kid. If you are autistic, being in that general education setting for PE, for lunch, but it seems to be almost universal. And I remember at one point really pushing the school district against that and saying, no, these aren't the inclusion opportunities. It's interesting because it seems to be the way it is in many places, not the individualized approach. So I'd love to hear more of your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think what you said about lazy inclusion is a really great way to say it. Because it's often the subjects that, first of all, we deem, and I say we broadly deem as like the least important, that somehow become these like inclusion classes.
Yeah.
And we give then teachers the least amount of training to facilitate that. While also then creating a system where there's social stigma, because who are these students who are now just like guests in our classroom, essentially? While not thinking about, like you said, the intentional planning that would need to go behind and should go behind having students in those special area classes. But to simply throw a student in and call it inclusion, I think in any realm, but in specifically those special areas, and I say special meaning like those non-core academic. In a way, lots of districts use it as like to reinforce their narrative of like, oh, see, it didn't work. Look, the gym class of 60 kindergartners didn't seem to work for that student.
Right.
Like,
in a highly sensory overwhelming, setting. Right.
And I think, if we're going to have a student not participate in something, like, let's look at how can we, I'd rather than be in a math class than in gym, quite frankly. Right. Because I'll tell you, like, maybe I'm throwing myself under the bus. Like, I didn't really participate in gym either. Like, I was, one of the girls on the side chit-chatting. So we hold disabled students to a higher standard in that way.
Yeah, and it almost seems like you got to. I mean, it's a matter of having low expectations, right? It's a matter of, well, this is the only inclusion that this child might be ready to handle,
right?
Because, like you said, there's not the expectation, and that's part of that approach as well. I have a question for you in terms of, in your experience, and this is always a hard question because often the answer is no, but in cases, and let me get to the question, which is there anywhere that is really doing it right? So, I mean, if you look across the world, are there places that are really doing well here?
Yeah, there are. I'll start with that. I don't believe and I said this in there, but I don't believe, again, that we'll ever have equity until we dismantle the special education system. I don't believe we can reform IDA enough to become equitable. And so I look at places like Italy and I look at places like Finland, which have completely receiving supports in ways that are fundamentally different, that students, I'm thinking about scholar Dr. Julia White, who's at Syracuse, who often talks about Finland, and that at any point up to about 30% of kids are receiving extra supports. Now, and they don't have to go through these hoops to get supports. And that might be for one reason or the other, disability or not. So yeah, there are places that are doing it right. This idea of inclusive education for all students is not a utopia. There are places that are doing it. There are districts in the United States that are doing it. There are countries that are nearly universally doing it. So yes, now my hesitation always in the US context to say, oh, this district or that district is doing it well is we know that with regime change, and I mean regime change and special education director or teacher or what have you, those can flip. When we see folks leave, fully inclusive districts have reverted back. Or we have districts then where people flock to, and there's nothing wrong with, obviously there's nothing wrong with moving to support your student with what they need, but then it becomes, challenging. If we now have a school district with 50% students with disabilities to make that inclusion happen. So yes, it is happening. I mean, I go back to, again, my own experience with inclusive education. So yeah, I guess short answer is yes, it is happening. It is not a utopia. It is happening in countries, and it is happening in districts across this country.
I love that you brought up kind of the thinking of the social model versus the medical model of disability. And it seems to me that when we're having this conversation about inclusion, it really is about kind of that whole mind shift into the social model versus the medical model. I wonder if you might explain to people that might not be as kind of familiar with those terms, kind of what we mean when we talk about the social model versus like a medical model, and how you think that inclusion really does fit that social model.
Yeah. So I'll start with the medical model. Is where we could sort of pathologize disability. We look at it from this, like we need to professionals, right, diagnose, and the problem is within the person. The problem is whether it's, you can't walk or you're not doing this, and it is all up against a normative non-disabled notion. So you are deviating from the norm because you're hearing, and we have to fix that, right? We have to fix these things. Whether that is behavior, whether that is something physical, et cetera. Whereas a social model locates the problem within structures in society. That if we had, let's say, folks who were signing and everybody was signing, well, would that disability, would that deafness rise to, a level of disability, right? So it's about fixing the systems around us. And I often talk about when I'm working with teachers or when I am advocating in IEP meetings, looking at things like what are those adult behaviors. So within a school context, when we look at a medical model, would be we need to fix that kid. We need to fix something about them, their behavior, their academics, et cetera. Whereas a social model is what do we as the adults, what are those adult behaviors that we are going to do to give access to that student? So it's not a fixing. We are looking at, from a social model, we're looking at everyone as just who they are, not better, not worse, just who they are, disability or not.
And how do we remove the barriers, right? It's not about fixing the individual. It's about how do we remove the barriers to success. Okay, so I want to get to some comments and questions here from our audience. And this is a good point for me to pause and let you know, if you are watching, if you have a question or you have a comment, please put that in the chat. But I have seen a couple of things that have popped up that I wanted to address. I've got something that's a bit of a multi part one here, but I'm going to kind of steer through this and start with a little bit of kind of a statement background. And Ruth Ann, thanks for joining us, is an autistic young adult. And we're always very excited to have autistic self-advocates here, really that are passionate and advocating for changes. I think, one of the places I'm sure that we would agree is the need to have the voice of lived experiences. So I want to begin by just kind of welcoming Ruth Ann, who has a couple questions here. And mentions that she's actually going to be speaking at a board meeting in June about her experiences. And that's so critical. She was Ruth Ann was asking about a particular program. And I know all different schools have all different kinds of programs. So you may not be familiar about this program, but typically what we're talking about here, this is a immersion program in a central New York school called, let's see, what was it called? I think I lost it, Visual Immersion Program. But often when we're talking about special programs, we are talking about segregated settings. And, and I think there was another part of it here. And Ruth Ann says, I don't know much about the program, but feel like it might be segregating autistic students from their peers. Not really sure. And certainly there's a lot of programs with a lot of names, depending on where you live. We have programs here in my area. There's one that was called the IL program, the SLE program. We, of course, have all sorts of behavioral programs as well in various states. And this is really what we're talking about. So what are your general thoughts when you hear about kind of these specialized programs?
So my understanding of that specific program is that is similar to like a VB MAP program, that it's designed for autistic students and also marketed towards students who are labeled as having a cognitive or intellectual disability. And I have I'll say I haven't looked in specifically to this program as much as I have like VB MAP and some of those others, but I think they are, Ruth Ann, you're correct that they are used almost exclusively in segregated settings is the first piece. The second piece is that the goal of those programs are to move students. They would say the goal is skill acquisition. I'm going to tell you that the hidden curriculum piece of that is to move students to a normative way of being, to get students, either to speak, to act in a certain way. We're going to see a lot of hand over hand. We're going to see a lot of like those prerequisite model, right? You have to do this, then this, then this. All the while, general education is surpassing us by So I would be really hesitant. It's not something that I would advocate for.
Right.
There's some really great work. I know Robin, Signal has written on the autism industrial complex and things. But I don't want us to remove the fact that we live in capitalism, and so many of these products are marketed for folks to make money, not for folks to gain those skills. So I'm really hesitant, really against most programs, especially when they have that underlying premise of moving students towards a more non-disabled or normative way of being.
Right. Often kind of very compliance-based programs that are really taking that medical model of what's the deficit and how do we. Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think that there's a lot of well-intentioned programs, but again, you need to look at the goals. What's the goal of the program? What's the goal of what you're doing in a therapy setting? What are the goals? And if your goal is to take a neurodivergent individual and push them into a neurotypical mold, your goal is the wrong goal. I think we absolutely need to be doing more to even celebrate the differences of neurodiversity, and there's so much there to offer, but so many of the approaches are about it's a deficit. How do we work on these things, and but they're sold to families, they're sold to parents,
and to school districts, quite frankly. I mean, they're sold right as these things that are going to be the exact thing that you need. And the irony is that those aren't they're not even the irony is that they're not even the skills that the students are going to need in the future. That to me is the most among the many infuriating pieces, I guess, isn't the most, but it is something that I'm like, come on, they're not even good skills. You're segregating because it just.
And we don't all need all the same skills. The world thrives on the diversity among us, and I think we often have a very linear view of that. Let me get to a couple other questions here. Laura said, what about when the IP team tells you that the gen ed environment is too stimulating for your child, who can keep up academically but is struggling behaviorally?
The first thing I would say, and maybe it's a little snarky, is well, how are we going to help improve your classroom management then? The second piece is the world is overstimulating. As a neurodivergent scholar myself, sometimes just sitting in the grad bay is overstimulating, but that doesn't mean I don't have to do it. That doesn't mean I don't need access to those spaces. So what can we do to both honor that the student has these support needs, whether that is changing the environment of the general education classroom, whether that is giving breaks outside of it, whether that is improving your classroom management. But arguably what that student needs the most, the skills, is to self-advocate, is to recognize when they're becoming overstimulated, and to gain the skills to help them self-regulate. Now, we're not going to be able to put them in an artificial environment where it's the perfect working conditions after K-12. Unless your goal is to put them into a day hab or an institution, we're going to have to gain those skills. And that may mean there are times where the student is out taking a walk, is out taking a break, is in the sensory room. Inclusion doesn't look the same for every student. So when I'll often get school districts that say, just give me the plan, we're going to do inclusion. Well, I don't know the students. I don't know the needs. For some students, that may mean standing up and stimming in the back of the classroom, and that's okay. A lot of school districts who will often say, well, they can't be in there because it's too stimulating. At the same time, force students to not stim. So how do we how do we do this? Is we first say that it's okay for students to regulate their bodies in the way they need to. And then we figure out ways to do that in the general education classroom.
Okay.
And that's sorry.
Yeah. So let me jump on that a little bit. And I have a comment here that I'm going to turn into a question that relates to kind of what you're saying. And the comment here comes from Colleen, who is very thankful for what we're doing, but talking about prepping for an IEP meeting tomorrow, and kind of loving what we're talking about here. So with that in mind, and kind of what we were just talking about, let's talk for a minute to Sarah Jo, the advocate that is sitting in the IEP meeting, where the school is resistant to inclusion. what are the kinds of things? So how in that process, because it's not going to be the first time you come in there and talk to them, a light bulb goes off and they get it. How do you begin to shape the IEP or to offer supports and accommodations, whatever it may be, goals, to begin moving the team in the right direction, begin getting the team moving in that direction? Because, again, the IEP, of course, is this very focused process. And, I mean, I have a lot of feelings about IEP meetings in general, but at the end of the day, if we're able to begin moving teams along in the right direction, it can be helpful for changing culture. So how do you do that? How do you do that as an advocate that you're running into where, and I can think of a parent I just talked to just recently in a general education setting because of behaviors, want to move to a behavioral, program, which I think is a mistake for the child, as it often may be. What do you do?
Yeah,
I know that's really putting you on the spot without enough information.
No,
but give me some hypotheticals.
I think the first thing is to look at. I try to understand why is the team resistant. I think understanding that first will help you then delineate what do we need to do. It is often a fear, right, of the unknown. So I think my first line of defense is always to say, like, we're here to support you through this. I'm not, ignorant to think, and I don't say this at IP meetings, but we know we have a real problem with how we train teachers in this country, and that teachers, special education, general education, regardless, do not leave higher education institutions with the knowledge they need to thoughtfully include students with support needs. So the first thing I like to figure out is, what is that resistance? Now, sometimes that resistance is just old-fashioned bigotry and believing that these students don't belong in my school. And I say that because I have had a principal in this year tell me that. And in those cases, when you're up against just real, hard, it's not going to, that's where I would look at the law pieces. But if we're at a piece of, I just think that the student can make more progress over here, that's where we look at bringing in both the research and helping the school understand that the way our students are going to engage with content and show what they know is going to look different, and that's okay. And that is typically the hang up that I see is, well, we want the student to do this, but they're not able to do it, whether that's writing, whether that's verbalizing, etc. And so it's about giving ways for them to see. And it's continuously, as opposed to the once a year IEP meeting, continuously checking in with the team. Where is that success? Where are those problem areas, so that we don't allow those to create such a large issue that we come to the IEP a year later never knowing that this was happening. And it's about the next piece to that is to look at, help them understand the long-term goal, because IEPs, right, are only for a year, and often folks only see that as the year time, and helping them understand that the skills we're going to gain in general education far surpass the academic gains, but also into those self-advocacy, the regulation, those communication pieces. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, showing them examples. There are a lot of works online that can show, here's how it really works. And I find those to be helpful. But it's about pointing out those little wins, okay, look, we did great on this math test, or we, had an improved day here. Because I think folks need to see that it's working, and not that we should have to beg, borrow, steal, or cheerlead to make this happen, because I do believe inclusive education is a human rights issue. There's also the practical side of we're also working with other humans. So
right. Yeah, and if you don't know of another way, it's hard to imagine another solution. So if and you mentioned higher ed, and I would agree with you. I think higher ed, there's a lot of accountability in terms of things that would-be teachers are not getting exposed to. People may go through higher ed and never even hear of things like restraint or seclusion, or a lot of the negative things that might happen. And the first time they end up in a classroom where these things are it becomes kind of, oh, well, this is what I'm being told is what we need to do in these situations. And without that exposure, I think it's dangerous. Getting back to your idea of resources. So certainly, I think about, parents that I've worked with, and even my own experiences of handing out books on IEP team meetings. I've handed out, Ross Green's books or Mona Delahooks. Are there any resources, particularly around inclusive education, that, what is the one must read, or what is the one thing that you would recommend to somebody that you might be trying to help them with a lens change to kind of really see the light? Is there anything like that comes to your mind? And if not, it'll probably come to you later, and you can always let me know.
I would say the two biggest ones, and I'm going to give you two instead of one, even though you asked for one, is Scott Danforth's Becoming a Great Inclusive Educator. And that one I would pick. I used it in the class I taught. Well, actually, Dr. Christy Ashby used it in her class that I happened to teach this year. That it does talk about the transformation that educators must go through, and really talks about how we as non-disabled or folks who are non-disabled really need to do this work. And so that is more of the like heart and mindset piece. And then I think Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen's more than just being in supporting students with complex support needs and inclusive settings is really a great like practical guide. Although, anything, any of Paula Kluth's work, any of Dr. Julie Costin's work, any of Christy Ashby's work, the list could go, on and on. I will say what I tend to tell folks is to not if you're going to give a book to educators or to your team, I would recommend that you go through and tab one or two pages that you're like, this is really important, because I would love to say that, as a classroom teacher, I would have read the book, but I'm going to tell you, I probably wouldn't have. I wouldn't have read the whole thing, certainly. So having those one or two pieces ready to go, I think is more digestible for folks.
Absolutely. And it's Becoming a Great Inclusive Educator. Is that the book from Scott?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I'll put a link to that also in the chat here. So let me just look here. I'm going to pull this up. I haven't read the whole thing yet. Tammy says, thank you so much. Autistic / ADHD adult with autistic ADHD kindergartner. Are there any IEP templates, lists of suitable goals? And kind of getting back to what we talked about a moment ago. Standard partial acceptance letters or other inclusive templates and structures that we as parents can use or ask our advocates to use that ultimately help restructure or transform our school's IEPs.
So Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen has a template exemplar IEP on her website. I think I would say this in terms of, it's hard, right, when we're trying to individualize things, because, I could have two students with the same diagnosis at the same school who need vastly different supports to be included, who have vastly different goals. So I would, I think there are some resources on how to best write goals, but I would from the start say this, start with your vision statement, and in your vision statement, say something very specific about our vision for our child is to be fully included in general education. And 10 years from now, 15 years from now, here's what we expect. We expect college to be an option. We expect, competitive work. And then we look at what are the child's skills. And then I see a friend of mine say that, think we should start with the typical expectations. Yes, we want to look at what are those standards? What is the end of year standard for a kindergartner for math, ELA, et cetera? And I tend to do math, reading, writing. And we would look at where are we and where do we want to go from there. And we do that because if we then don't see things like, okay, we're going to work on an analog clock for 12 years when no one knows how to read an analog clock anymore. But also it doesn't help them in the, quite frankly.
You're making me feel old, Sarah Jo. I know how to read a clock.
Well, I'll say sometimes when I put on my fancy watch, it's a little bit of a struggle, guys. So
but I don't take my change belt to the store. So.
Right. uh, yeah, so looking at like if they're adding and subtracting, for example, or if
Right.
they're doing, you know, a linear equation, if that's a big piece of the year, then maybe that's what we target. It shouldn't be these just like, oh, what do I feel like these prerequisite skills? No, what are the typically what are the expectations for students who are not identified as having a disability? And
Mhm,
that's where we go from. Even if it means modifying it greatly,
mhm,
that's
mhm,
okay.
mhm. Great, great. So I put a couple of those resources in the chat as well, and I did see there's a sample elementary IEP that's in there, so that might be a great resource for folks.
Mhm.
And let's see, I've got one more also from Cheryl. Many don't even include goals regarding holding a pencil for a kindergartner, so right there they are
Mhm.
perceived as incapable. Um,
Mhm.
Look at this. And we have our friend Dr. Mona Della Hook
Oh.
saying that Monica Osgood wrote a good book
Oh,
for
good.
Perfectum on inclusive education. I'll see if I can find that one as
Perfect.
well. So we're just about reaching the end of our time here together, but this has really been really fantastic, and I love the passion you bring to this, and again. Um, with so many things, we wish we could change the world overnight, and it's not always
Mhm.
possible. But the more self advocates and parents and others that are out there advocating for these kinds of changes, advocating for
Mhm.
inclusion, advocating for high expectations, advocating for kind of social models of supporting people. Oh, and Mona put that link in the chat for us. All the better. The more we have this kind of work. So I
Mhm.
really appreciate your passion and what you're doing here, and want to thank you for being with us today and sharing what you're doing. So how else can people learn about your work and what you have planned in the future? I saw you posted recently something about like I'm done with all these things right now, and
Yeah.
but I'm sure you've
Yeah.
got a lot on your plate. So what's coming up with you?
So thank you so much. So I just finished my second year in the doctoral program, and I have officially done with coursework forever, which is kind of a scary thing when I was like, oh my gosh, I've been in school for 20 years. So now I go into my qualifying exams and ultimately my dissertation. Which will take the majority of my time. I do a little bit of consulting with school districts, consulting with families. I'm pretty active on Facebook. That's the best place to get a hold of me. If you need, support, yes, as Cheryl said, until postdoc, and then yes, and then we can only think about 2 more years, 2 more years to get about 2 more years to get this PhD, and then I continue to research,
So we'll
write.
be looking for
Yeah.
lots more great things coming from you. Do you also support? You mentioned kind of doing IEP meetings. Do you support people in that capacity as well?
I
And to that extent, I mean, given the world that we live in, are you able to support people outside of your community?
Yeah, so I've actually yes, so I'll say this. I've supported I keep pretty vigorous data on I've supported over 1,000 students to move from segregated settings to inclusive ones through an IEP process in all 50 states. Now, because of where I am in my doctoral program, I'm not taking on new advocacy folks at this time, but I am happy to look over IEPs and help guide you and connect you with an advocate in your area, and to be a resource if things go awry. Um,
Fantastic. Sergio, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
I always greatly enjoy these conversations myself, and I know we've got a lot of people that have been very actively participating today. I encourage people that have been watching this, share these with others. I mean, share these if you're an educator, share it with other educators or administrators. If you're a parent, share them with other parents or even your teachers and staff. The more we can kind of spread the word, the more we're going to bring about and help to bring about change. So, Sergio, I will let you go. I've got a quick announcement here for folks, but thank you so much. Did you have any final words before we
Yeah,
let you sign off?
yeah. I will just say, I'm a believer that school placement will determine the quality of life, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much, Guy, for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that today. I know I did. And I think, another fantastic presentation. I think we're really fortunate to have so many great guests that come on and share their knowledge and their experiences, and really hopefully help to lead to some positive change. I do want to mention we've got another event coming up in 2 weeks. And actually, in the same vein here, we're going to be talking more about inclusion. We're doing an interview with Kristen Wiens, who is an inclusion coach from British Columbia, Canada. And I'll just tell you that if you think you recognize that name, you might. Kristen does a lot of amazing illustrations that you've probably seen on social media. I don't have one to show you right now, but I'll have some next time. And does some amazing work of helping to get the messages out of things that we can do to better support kids. So really looking forward to that coming up again here in our next session. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks. Take care.